October 4th, 1957. Americans are gathered around their television sets watching their favorite evening shows, completely unaware that 550 miles above their heads, history is being made. A small metal sphere no bigger than a beach ball circles the Earth every 96 minutes, transmitting a simple beep 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 signal that would shatter American confidence forever. This is Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, and it belongs to America's greatest enemy, the Soviet Union. In just 184 pounds of polished metal, the Soviets had achieved what seemed impossible and left the United States scrambling in the dust of the space race. The morning after Sputnik's launch, Washington, D.C. erupts into chaos. Senators demand answers. Newspaper headlines scream about Soviet supremacy. President Eisenhower tries to downplay the achievement, calling it one small ball in the air. But behind closed doors, Pentagon officials are terrified. If the Soviets can put a satellite into orbit, they can deliver a nuclear warhead to any city in America. The Cold War has suddenly become a space war, and America is losing badly. Defense Secretary Neil McElroy receives urgent calls from military commanders who realize the unthinkable. America's technological superiority is a myth. But the Soviets aren't finished humiliating America. On November 3, 1957, just 1 month after Sputnik 1, they launched Sputnik 2 carrying Laika, a stray dog from Moscow's streets, making her the first living creature to orbit Earth. While Americans mourn for the doomed dog, Soviet scientists are already planning their next impossible achievement. April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human being to orbit Earth, completing his historic flight in just 108 minutes. While Americans celebrate this achievement for mankind, the U.S. government knows the devastating truth. They're not just behind in the space race, they're being humiliated on the world stage. President John F. Kennedy receives the news in a private briefing, his face growing pale as he realizes the Soviets have achieved yet another impossible first. Every major newspaper around the globe features Gagarin's smiling face, while American rockets continue exploding on launch pads, earning the nickname Kaputnik. The scorecard by 1961 tells a devastating story. Soviets have the first satellite, first animal in orbit, first human in space, and first photographs of the moon's dark side. Americans have one 15-minute suborbital flight and a string of explosive failures broadcast live on television for the world to mock. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev publicly laughs at American efforts, calling them a circus act. This is how America found itself staring into the abyss, realizing their enemy had not just caught up. They had leaped decades ahead into the future. By 1962, NASA engineers are working 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and Kennedy's impossible deadline. The Apollo program is America's most ambitious engineering project since the Manhattan Project. But behind the confident press releases lies a terrifying reality. They're building a machine to shoot humans 240,000 miles into space, using technology that barely exists. Every component must be invented from scratch. Every system tested under conditions no human has ever experienced. The spacecraft that will carry American astronauts to the moon is essentially a controlled explosion, wrapped around a tin can, and everyone knows it. January 27, 1967, 6:31 p.m., Launch Complex 34 at Cape Kennedy. 3 American heroes are strapped inside Apollo 1 during what should be a routine test. Astronauts Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee. The command module is pressurized with pure oxygen, a decision made to save weight that will prove fatal. At exactly 6:31:04, Roger Chaffee's voice crackles over the radio. "Fire! We've got a fire in the cockpit." 17 seconds later, all communication goes silent. The pure oxygen atmosphere turns Apollo 1 into a furnace, reaching temperatures of 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Rescue teams battle through thick, choking smoke, but the intense heat and pressure have sealed the hatch shut. By the time they reach the astronauts, it's too late. America's moon program has claimed its first victims, and the nation watches in horror as their space heroes are buried, while the Soviets continue their relentless march toward lunar victory. The Apollo 1 fire destroys more than 3 lives. It shatters NASA's confidence and Kennedy's timeline. Congressional hearings reveal shocking negligence, flammable materials throughout the spacecraft, faulty wiring, a hatch that takes 90 seconds to open in an emergency. NASA Administrator James Webb faces brutal questioning as senators demand to know how America's best engineers could make such fatal mistakes. The spacecraft is completely redesigned from the ground up, delaying the program by nearly 2 years, while the Soviets continue launching cosmonauts with seeming ease. Behind the Iron Curtain, however, the Soviets are fighting their own secret disasters. Their massive N-1 moon rocket, designed to rival America's Saturn V, suffers catastrophic explosion after explosion. On July 3, 1969, the second N-1 test creates one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history, completely destroying the launch pad and setting the Soviet lunar program back by years. But unlike America's public failures, Soviet disasters remain classified, allowing them to maintain the illusion of superiority while American engineers rebuild Apollo piece by piece, knowing that every delay brings them closer to losing the greatest race in human history. December 21, 1968. After the devastating Apollo 1 fire and 2 years of redesigning everything, NASA makes the most audacious gamble in human history. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders strap themselves to a Saturn V rocket and blast off toward the moon on Apollo 8. Not to land, but to orbit. It's a desperate move born from intelligence reports that the Soviets are planning their own lunar flyby mission for early 1969. NASA decides to beat them there, even if it means sending astronauts around the moon in a spacecraft that has never been tested beyond Earth orbit. The mission is so risky that Borman's wife is told there's only a 50-50 chance her husband will come home alive. For 68 hours, the 3 Americans hurtle through the void, becoming the first humans to leave Earth's gravitational sphere of influence. On Christmas Eve 1968, as America reels from the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, from Vietnam War protests and social upheaval, Apollo 8 enters lunar orbit. The astronauts broadcast live on television to the largest audience in human history, nearly 1 billion people, reading from the Book of Genesis as they show the world its first glimpse of the moon's desolate surface and the beautiful Earthrise emerging from behind the lunar horizon. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, begins William Anders, and suddenly the space race becomes something more profound than national competition. It becomes humanity's first step toward becoming a spacefaring species. But Apollo 8's success only increases the pressure on Apollo 11. By early 1969, NASA engineers know they have one shot at Kennedy's deadline. The moon landing must happen before December 31, 1969, or America loses the space race forever. Every component is tested and retested, every procedure rehearsed thousands of times. But landing on the moon remains an act of controlled catastrophe that has never been attempted. On July 16, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins blast off from Cape Kennedy with 400,000 NASA employees, contractors, and support staff having contributed to their mission. 4 days later, as Armstrong manually pilots the lunar module Eagle toward the moon's surface, flight controllers in Houston watch in horror as fuel gauges drop toward empty. The original landing site is too rocky, forcing Armstrong to fly horizontally across the lunar landscape searching for a safe spot, while precious fuel burns away. Mission Control calls out 60 seconds of fuel remaining, then 30 seconds. At this point, an abort would likely be impossible. They're in what engineers grimly call the dead man's curve, too low to safely rocket back to orbit. Armstrong's heart rate jumps from 77 to 156 beats per minute as he fights to find solid ground. With literally 25 seconds of fuel remaining, post-mission analysis would later reveal it was actually 45 seconds due to measurement errors. The Eagle touches down at Tranquility Base. Armstrong's immortal words crackle across the radio. Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. In that moment, America has achieved the impossible and won the greatest race in human history. July 20th, 1969, 10:56 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Neil Armstrong opens the hatch of the Eagle lunar module and begins his careful descent down a 9-rung ladder to the moon's surface. 650 million people around the globe are watching the grainy black and white television transmission. Nearly 1/6 of all humanity glued to their screens as history unfolds in real time. In living rooms across America, families huddle around television sets. In London, BBC and ITV collaborate for the first time to provide round-the-clock coverage. Even in the Soviet Union, the broadcast airs with a 10-minute delay. Soviet commentators forced to acknowledge American triumph while trying to emphasize the international significance rather than admit defeat. Armstrong's left boot touches the lunar dust at exactly 0256 UTC, and his words echo across the cosmos. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The phrase he composed during the journey has become humanity's most famous quote, spoken on a world where no human voice had ever been heard before. Television cameras capture his tentative first steps as he tests the moon's strange gravity, bouncing slightly with each movement. While 240,000 miles away, Mission Control erupts in silent celebration. They dare not interrupt this sacred moment. 19 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin joins Armstrong on the surface, and together they begin the most extraordinary science experiment in human history. They plant an American flag in the lunar soil, its fabric held rigid by a hidden rod since there's no wind to make it wave. The image becomes instantly iconic, two spacesuited figures standing beside Old Glory on an alien world, but it also sparks immediate controversy. Critics argue that America has turned the moon landing into a territorial conquest, rather than a peaceful exploration for all mankind. Congressional letters had poured into NASA months earlier, some demanding the American flag be planted, others insisting on a United Nations flag. The debate had been so heated that Congress actually amended NASA's funding bill to specify that the flag of the United States and no other flag shall be implanted or otherwise placed on the surface of the moon. The irony is that the flag's placement was almost an afterthought. NASA engineer Jack Kinsler had to charter a private Learjet just 4 days before launch to deliver the flag assembly to Kennedy Space Center, where it was installed at 4 a.m. while the Saturn V sat fueled and ready. Now, as Armstrong and Aldrin struggled to drive the flagpole into the hard lunar surface, they're unwittingly creating one of the most politically charged images in human history, a stars and stripes claiming the moon for America in the ultimate Cold War victory photograph. For 2 hours and 15 minutes, the astronauts collect 47.5 pounds of lunar rocks, conduct experiments, and take photographs that will inspire generations. But the most profound impact isn't scientific. It's the shared human experience of watching two members of our species walk on another world. In the United States, 93% of all televisions are tuned to the moon landing. Families gather in public squares, strangers embrace, and for one brief moment, humanity transcends its divisions to witness something miraculous. The broadcast becomes the most watched television event in history, creating what one observer calls an almost mystical unification of all people in the world at that moment. Children who watch Armstrong's first steps will grow up to become the engineers, scientists, and astronauts who push humanity deeper into space. The grainy footage transmitted across the vacuum of space and into living rooms worldwide proves that the impossible is just another problem waiting to be solved by human ingenuity, courage, and the refusal to accept defeat. America has not just won the space race. They've given humanity its first glimpse of what we might become when we stop looking down at our differences and start looking up at the infinite possibilities that await us among the stars. While Americans celebrated in the streets on July 20th, 1969, Soviet engineers were desperately trying to hide the greatest engineering disaster in human history. Just 17 days before Apollo 11 launched on July 3, 1969, the second test of their massive N-1 moon rocket created the largest non-nuclear explosion ever recorded on Earth. The blast was so powerful it completely vaporized the launch pad, shattered windows 25 miles away, and sent a shockwave that registered on seismographs across Europe. This was the Soviet Union's answer to the Saturn V, a 344-foot-tall monster with 30 engines that was supposed to carry cosmonauts to the moon. But every single test flight ended in catastrophic failure, a devastating secret that wouldn't be revealed to the world until the collapse of the Soviet Union 20 years later. The N-1 program was plagued by a fatal design flaw. Instead of NASA's 5 powerful F-1 engines, the Soviets tried to cluster 30 smaller NK-15 engines together, creating an impossible engineering nightmare. The engines had never been tested together as a complete system before launch, meaning every flight was essentially a $500 million experiment in controlled destruction. The program's brilliant chief designer, Sergei Korolev, had died in 1966. taking his expertise to the grave and leaving the project rudderless. By 1974, after 4 spectacular failures and billions of rubles wasted, the Soviets quietly canceled their moon program, scrapped the remaining N-1 rockets, and pretended they had never intended to race America to the moon. One of the greatest lies in Cold War history. But America's victory came far closer to disaster than anyone realized at the time. Classified documents revealed decades later show that Apollo 11 nearly ended in tragedy during the crew's return to Earth. As Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins plummeted toward the Pacific Ocean at 25,000 miles per hour, their discarded service module, which should have safely skipped off Earth's atmosphere like a stone across water, instead chased their command capsule through the atmosphere. "Houston, we got the service module going by. A little high and a little bit to the right," Aldrin radioed to Mission Control, his voice betraying no hint of the mortal danger they were in. The 25-ton service module was breaking apart and splintering into glowing pieces just yards away from the crew capsule. If even one chunk had struck their heat shield, all 3 astronauts would have been incinerated during re-entry. Gary Johnson, an Apollo electrical engineer, later admitted, "If things had gone bad, we could have lost the Apollo 11 crew. We were lucky." This near catastrophe was kept classified for decades, buried in NASA's files alongside dozens of other close calls that could have ended America's space program in tragedy. There was the stuck hatch that nearly prevented Armstrong and Aldrin from leaving the moon, the broken circuit breaker that Aldrin fixed with a felt-tip pen, and the fuel line blockage that came within seconds of stranding the crew in lunar orbit. Each successful mission was built on a foundation of improvisation, luck, and the heroic refusal of engineers and astronauts to accept defeat even when facing impossible odds. The true decision that changed human history wasn't made in the Oval Office or the Kremlin, but in the humble workshops and laboratories where engineers chose to push the boundaries of what was possible rather than accept the limitations of what was safe. President Kennedy's bold promise had forced America to attempt the impossible with 1960s technology. Computers less powerful than modern calculators, heat shields made of honeycomb and resin, and navigation systems that required astronauts to sight stars through periscopes like ancient mariners. The Soviets had the advantage of secrecy. Their failures could be hidden, their cosmonauts' deaths covered up, their program's true goals denied. But America chose transparency, broadcasting their failures live on television for the world to see and judge. This decision, more than any rocket engine or computer system, ultimately won the space race. When Americans succeeded, the world watched together. When they failed in public, learned from their mistakes, and tried again. The moon landing wasn't just a victory of American engineering. It was a triumph of the idea that humanity's greatest achievements come not from secrecy and fear, but from open collaboration, shared knowledge, and the courage to pursue dreams that seem impossible until the moment they become inevitable. The space race ended not because America built better rockets, but because they built a better way of reaching for the stars.